Roy, R-O-Y, Bud, B-U-D-D.
And your branch, rank, and what do I always forget to say?
Division.
Division.
I served the United States Army. I was commissioned as an infantry officer out of Fort Benning, Georgia. And then they sent me to flight school. And I served with an air cav unit in Vietnam, the 7th of the 1st Air Cav Regiment, not the Horse Blanket. Horse Blanket is the 1st Air Cav Division with the big yellow.
You know those guys with the hats that they're trying to wear?
We no, we also had cav hats, but we were a separate unit, and we flew under the 1st Aviation Group in the Delta.
How old were you? What year? And why did you go into the military?
Let's see, I was about 24. I was a senior in college, and the war in Vietnam was not going to end anytime soon. And I've never been somebody who could sit around and wait, and I didn't want to sit around waiting to somebody send me a letter, mail me a letter, greetings from the United States government. So I started my senior year doing a little research. If I was going to go, who did I want to go with? I had some friends that had gone into the Marine Corps. I knew people had been in the Marine Corps, and I at one time entertained that thought. But there's always a possibility that you may decide to stay, and the Army had much wider choices. They had actually more people, wider choices. And so I applied for OCS training. They had a deferral program where you could be accepted, and then you could defer actually going to, I think it was actually up to a year. I was originally scheduled to go in the fall after I graduated from college, and the class got deferred, and I ended up going in January. And I actually always felt that military service was just part of the things you did. You know, that was, it was just part of growing up. You know, you went to school and you went and did your time, and you got out and kind of, you know, it's just something you had to do.
Did you have family members that were in?
My older brother actually went in the Air Force. My brother John went in the Air Force, and he was there in the Air Force for a little over 4 years. And we're the only two in my immediate family who had ever served. I have two younger brothers and a sister.
So describe your, you got to Vietnam, what year was it, and first impressions when you got there?
Well, the military, you get a lot of interesting first impressions, and it usually starts off like, what the hell have I done? But it was in March of 70, and you have some leave before you ship out. And I was actually at Hunter Army Airfield. After I graduated from flight school, they kept us down there doing a few things. And it was wintertime, you're cold. And so you get your orders, you go to California, you catch a plane, and they send you across the big pond. And you step off the plane in Vietnam, and the first thing is, the impression is, well, there's two. It's the heat, because it's very hot, very humid. And the country had a smell all its own. You know, it just kind of stuck with you. So it's like the first time you go downtown, and like the town of Vinh Long was next to our airfield where I eventually ended up. And they have an open marketplace. And the typical American, you walk in, and the first thing you want to do is basically throw up, because you can't, they have literally raw meat hanging out, and it's covered with flies, and it's very primitive society, and they have open sewers and whatnot, and it rocks you. But the impression is that it was a huge undertaking. There was a lot of activity. We landed at Tan Son Nhut. They had a repo where they brought in new people, would go through this facility, and the people who were leaving were also going through the same area. And then they would decide where they needed somebody with your MOS. If you're a helicopter pilot, where do we need helicopter pilots? And so you had no idea. It's not necessarily preordained at that point where you went in as a replacement to somebody who was either going home or got injured or wounded. And the process can take 12 hours or 4 days. And so you'd go down there and they'd have orders for people, and they didn't have orders for you. You just kind of sit around and hung out and waited till the next day. I finally got orders for, after I think about 2 days, for the first aviation group, which operated out of Canton. And so we went from Saigon down to Canton. It's under an hour's flight time. And then you realize that there really are people in the military who have an interesting sense of humor, because they had a transient barracks where they would put people up overnight or for 2 days until they assigned them down to another unit where they'd eventually be for their tour. And so they told you, all right, to transient barracks, you go down the street, you make a left, at the next corner you make a right, and you'll see this big sign on the building. It says transient barracks. Just go in there, find a bunk, throw your stuff there, et cetera, and they'll tell you where to eat. And so we did this. We dragged our duffel bags down there and looking around, and you realize that they have the transient barracks, and right next door to the transient barracks, with a sign just as big as Graves Registration. So it's welcome to Vietnam. It was a rather sobering experience, to say the least. So.
Can we, and if I ask you a question, still answer Kevin.
Yeah, look at me, Roy.
He's your focal point. Can we go back for a second, Roy, to how you become a helicopter pilot in the Army? Like, how does that happen? I always want to know how people find their job. How did that one find you?
The official version or the real version? The official version is you had to volunteer for flight school. You couldn't be drafted into flight school. You had to volunteer. And my theory was they encouraged some people to, because when we were going through OCS, we were real good at some things, but we lacked either military bearing, common sense, and common military courtesy. So they said, he'll never make a good parade ground officer. Let's make him a pilot, because you expect them to be, knuckle draggers and whatnot. And I had applied for, they used to have what they call a dream sheet. You would apply for further training, and then they would decide whether you wanted to do it. So I'd applied for Special Forces because I saw the movie and that seemed like a cool idea, and Ranger training and flight school. My brother John, who had been in the Air Force, was a aviation mechanic, and I'd actually flown in a couple of civilian helicopters, and I thought that was neat. And during our training, we had flown in helicopters on military exercises, and I thought this is really a neat way to get around. My brother could take a helicopter apart and put it back together again, and it would fly better. What I didn't know about the mechanics of how the helicopter worked actually amazed my brother after I'd gotten out. He'd say, he'd ask me some mechanical question. I'd say, beats the dickens out of me. I kick the skids, turn it on, and it either goes or it doesn't go. So I had put in for flight school. So then you have to take a written exam, see if you have some sort of aptitude for it. You have to take an extensive physical. And there was one other part of it, and that was interesting, because they would eliminate people along the way. And out of my OCS class, I will just say there's 200 people in my OCS company. We'll say 50 decided that they want to put in for flight because they heard that, one, you get flight pay, you get more money. So they said, well, that sounds like a good idea. So of the 50, maybe 10 got eliminated through testing or physical. And then if you got past all this, they walk you into a room, and they have he was a major, he was a helicopter pilot, an infantry guy, and he says, I'm here to explain to you the last step in order for you to be accepted into the flight training program. And he says, you have to sign a document and this is exactly the way he said it. You have to sign a document called voluntary indef. And of course, somebody says, what's that? He said, that's a document that says you agree to remain in the military indefinitely as long as we want you. You're going to stay as long as we need you. He goes, well, what do you mean, as long as you need me? He says, as long as we need you. He said, indefinitely. You know, no DEROS date, no termination date. It could be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Which was somewhat, you could see people sort of sit back like, you mean I could be in here like for a long, long time? And they said, yes. And he said, the reality is, though, he said, what it really means is that you'll go through flight school, you'll go to Vietnam, you'll do a tour in Vietnam, you'll come back, and then you'll go back and you'll do a second tour, at least. So I figure you'll do at least 3 years or the rest of your life, whichever's longer. And about half the people got up and walked out of the room. They just got... It was just, and you could have heard a pin drop because he was dead serious. He said, 3 years or the rest of your life, whichever's longer.
Why did you stay?
That, you know, I'm still wondering that. And, you know, it's every now and then some people you get to respond by challenging them to some degree, saying this is going to be long, dirty, painful, and 2/3 of you aren't going to make it. I'm going to be one of those 1/3. And I decided I'd rather fly over the rice paddies than walk through them because I had done that. I mean, I'd done that tromping all over Georgia. And you get also the sense that you might have, that's why I volunteer for Special Forces. I'd rather work with 12 people who know what they're doing than 100 that don't know what they're doing and could get you hurt. And I was intrigued by it. I'd never had that. When I was a civilian, never interested in flying. My brother was, I wasn't. But flying the helicopters, the little I'd done of it, seemed pretty neat. So I decided I wanted to do it. I wanted to try it.
So describe a typical mission or a job. You know, what were you flying around? What were you doing?
Well, let me give you back it up. When you go to flight school, you go to, all the primary helicopter training was done in Fort Walters, Texas, which is probably about 40 miles west of Fort Worth. And it was Camp Walters, I think. But it was a military installation that was not that big, but when they expanded the helicopter training, and I think they selected this plot of real estate to do the training because there was nothing around it you could destroy by crashing into it. Yeah, so if you crashed your helicopter, there was little or nothing you could destroy. You know, the civilian population was relatively safe. And when you went out there, the first thing that you had discovered that what I called the seasoned soldiers, see, they had guys who had been to Vietnam or back, and then they decided they wanted to go to flight school, and there were a number of captains who had been to Vietnam and were back, and they decided, and you just, because all of our experience at that point from the guys like myself, we had been in basic AIT, OCS, we had been in training. We'd never really been in the real Army. We'd never been really assigned to a unit in any way, shape, or form. So everything was like a training and a school environment. And what you didn't know was massive, but you discovered one of the best kept secrets in the military that all of the NCOs automatically know about, and most of the officer corps knows about it after, but the NCOs find out about it first. It's called per diem. Somebody said per diem. We said, what's that? Well, the Army pays you additional money per day to offset your expense. I mean, they pay. We were getting, like, somebody said, well, you're in school, we're going to give you a 50% pay raise. And it's like virtually tax-free. You go, oh, really? So the first thing that they went out and bought motorcycles and fast cars and et cetera, et cetera. But we wanted to just stay in flight school forever because, you know, you got all this money.